Welcome back to Russ Mafsar TV. I am very happy to have Russ here, Russ Mitchell, and welcome him to Russ Mafsar TV. Hi, Russ. How are you today?
Good afternoon, Manusher. Doing very well.
Russ, I have known Russ for quite a very long time, and Russ is a martial artist, also a swordsman, and he teaches. He's going to explain to you different types of European weapons, as well as savate and a martial art, which is like, let's say, if I may say so, he's going to correct me, like kickboxing and something like this in that direction. And he teaches both of them. And I'm going now to give the floor to him. Russ, could you please introduce yourself to our viewers, please?
Hi there. So I'm Russ. I teach at Winged Sabre Historical Fencing out of Warlord Combat Academy in Irving, Texas. And I teach a combination of historical fencing and somewhat old school savate, which is allied with boxe-francaise. I don't do a lot of ring craft, primarily because the students I have and my focus tend to be people who want to get into the sport but don't know how. So whereas Manusher deals with very high-level martial artists, I tend to be a specialist in beginners or people who used to train a lot and want to come back in without hurting themselves. So do you want me to dive into descriptions of the styles or talk more about?
First, let us, tell us more about yourself. How did you start, how your journey in martial arts started, please?
All
Tell
right,
us
so
about that.
I am the classic stereotype of the kid who was never expected to amount to anything physically. When I was a late teenager, I went to the military, did the tests. The military didn't want me. I had enough health conditions that they said, you will work in supply and you will never be deployed anywhere. I did some athletics here and there, and I always enjoyed running, was never particularly good at any of it. I was incredibly clumsy as a child. My folks were afraid that literally that Child Protective Services would come by because I had so many bruises, because I didn't know how to walk through a room without banging into every piece of furniture on the way through. I went to college. I started doing a little bit of martial arts here and there based on just whatever was available, because my twin brother and I realized, wow, agile people know where their bodies are. And this was keenly interesting to me. So I did a little bit of Tai Chi, a little bit of Nimpo, a little bit of karate here and there, whatever judo I could pick up. And eventually I wound up in grad school, and just by luck of the draw, I wound up in a topic in East Central European history that pulled me to Hungary. And while I was there, I bumped into a gentleman who had a saber and axe lineage. And then during the same year, a Georgian fellow who had a lineage of swordplay that he had learned. And when I came back to Texas to get myself back on my feet and prepare life for having a new wife and all that sort of stuff, I bumped into yet another little living lineage. And I'd been researching historical fencing for quite some time. In fact, I've still got the Paulus Hector Mayer great big, what's it called, microfilm sitting on my coffee table in the other room, and a bunch of other manuscripts we pulled out. But my own focus was always in the living lineages. So I trained for about 10 years in savate until I got hurt and had to figure out why had I gotten hurt and what had happened. And along the way, I sort of figured out, oh, you know, there were a lot of people who were training harder than me who didn't get anywhere near as far as I did because there were defects in their mechanics that they didn't recognize and didn't understand what they were doing. And our instructor didn't know how to identify them, let alone remedy them. So I had a few years where I was basically just literally trying to figure out how to move through my day without being crippled. And I gradually got back into training because an associate out in Phoenix was hosting a charity tournament to benefit sex trafficking victims. So I went out and I got beat up, and I realized, you know, it's time to get back into this. And along the way, a bunch of students said, hey, we want you to teach us. And I said, there are a lot of people who can teach you much better than I am. I'm old and busted. And they said, yes, but you're the person we know and trust not to bust us. And so I wound up with a club because they wouldn't take no for an answer. So if you look at every bad stereotype of martial arts life, I'm literally that guy.
I mean, Okay, for our viewers, I mean, this is, Ross is American, let's put it that way, because you all know, I mean, this channel is viewed mostly by Americans, and I studied in the US. I mean, if you were British, I would have said that you're doing British understatement, But okay, you're American, not British, but very lovely introduction. Let me just go back to Hungarian Sabre, the lineage. Could you tell us about this lineage that you learned? What's the name of this system? I mean, Hungarians are a proud nation of having lots of good swordsmen and saber play. Could you just tell us which lineage you learned from Hungary?
So what I learned is actually part of a broken lineage. So my instructor's grandfather was a Hussar drill master in just before and during World War I. And after the war, they returned to Transylvania, and there was some additional fighting because of problems with the government going communist and invading the neighbors, and problems with the neighbors invading them. It's very complicated. And to this day, there are still very hard and very ferocious feelings around the events surrounding World War I. Long story short, they wound up on the wrong side of the border underneath Ceausescu, and they couldn't study openly. The material is very standard Hussar Sabre play for the era, but I have to caution folks, it's not the Italo-Hungarian lineage that became mainstream Hungarian fencing. There's sort of an accidental history with Austro-Hungarian fencing that we don't have specific set lineages that come down from the national government that are enforced. It's sort of like being a professor. Once you're given the rank of fencing instructor, you're entitled to teach any way that you want to. And there is a great diversity of teaching methods. So I can show you the weapon that was taught in a moment. And one of the things that distinguishes the lineage in which I learned is that it used what some other folks refer to as a candelabra guard when the weapons are very heavy and it's held in the center line. And in order to deal with the mass of the weapon, it's moved from the handle. This had basically gone away in the western half of the country and in the big Italo-Hungarian lineages because they were using much lighter weight weapons. But let me grab that saber so I can show you what I'm talking about with the heavy issue weapon of the era. So this is an M1904 Hungarian Sabre. And this is a beast of a weapon. It is large. It weighs in at around 1,100 grams. So it is very much on the very, very heavy end of weapons used in the early 20th century, and frankly would be perfectly at home on any medieval battlefield. It has a very forward balance. Even though it's got a large basket, you can see where the balance is sitting here. This is not very late, close to the hilt, I'm going to make my wrist moulinets like this kind of fencing. You have to use the wrist and articulate with the hand, but dealing with that forward balance is very much a factor with this weapon. One of the things that distinguishes the Hungarian weapons, and which is in common with the other lineages, even though the primary stance is different, is the use of the false edge. The false edge on back is the distinguishing characteristic of Hungarian fencing, and yeomen on sabers are primordial to Hungarian blades since at least the 9th or 10th century. So if you look at Austro-Hungarian fencing, or you're wondering what makes Hungarian fencing Hungarian, at least as early as we have records, it's the extensive use of the false edge. The Italians, who use it more than most other nations, will throw a false edge cut every 10, 15, 20 cuts. The Hungarian uses the false edge every second or third cut.
A big difference.
It's a huge difference. And because of it, it changes the lines of attack and defense considerably. Whereas a Western European would moulinet the weapon around and bring it in a circle to start a new attack, the Hungarian will pull the weapon back towards him, looking for a way to get a piece of the target on the way back. So there's basically never a point at which the weapon isn't available to strike.
Yes. And very interesting. And this saber you showed was an original saber. Did I understand you correctly? From early 20th century. Did I understand you correctly?
That's correct. It is an original.
Original. Could you please also tell us, you learned also Georgian swords. system
I
from
did.
Georgia.
I did. It's a very bizarre little accident. I bumped into a scholar named Levan Tatashvili, and he had preserved a little bit of Kevsereti swordplay, and it was a very, very limited system. And I've worked with other folks who do Georgian swordplay and played with it back and forth, but it was a 3-cut system, literally 3 cuts, used with the hand pulled back to hold a buckler if you had it or not if you didn't, where you're basically somewhat similar to Ichiryu, throwing an attack designed to catch the opponent on their bevel and flat and throw them off to the side. I can show the basic movements for that if you like.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, I'll show you the movements. They were going to develop a fighting and fencing system just around those 3 movements alone. You might think they'd absolutely lost their minds, but it worked, and it actually works surprisingly well, especially if you do have a buckler for the offhand. And what it basically does is attempt to constrain the opponent's attacks while giving yourself an angle in which you can deflect their blow and own the center line of your choice. So Levan's quote to me while I'm learning this is, if he cuts, you also cut. If you are brave, you will not be cut. And of course, I thought he was absolutely nuts when we first started playing it. And then I found out that I could actually do this very, very stripped down system of fencing and do shockingly well with it. So I've always kept it in the background. I don't teach it publicly, even though it's very simple. I do teach it in private to people who are willing to get their hands whacked an awful lot.
Interesting. And so, did I understand you correctly? He, in Georgian swordsmanship, has 3 cuts, be it with buckler or without buckler. They follow the same principles.
Same principles, yes. He'll cover the weapon hand with the buckler if he has it, but if he doesn't have it, he still makes the same 3 cuts, and he has a very sided stance.
Okay, yes, that's right. I understand. If he doesn't have it, okay, I understand that.
Yep.
And why don't you teach this method openly?
I have found that there are very few students who are interested in learning simple, precise systems. It's just not alluring enough for most of the people in American culture who want to play swordplay. A system with only 3 cuts where you just go to town working on very precise amounts of angle doesn't tend to impress people as a system. What I found is there are a very small number of people who are attracted to those sort of things. And you don't fill a class of 15 people with it, but you might have 1 or 2 people who are willing to work it very intensively. And so those wind up becoming private classes by definition.
You know, it's so beautiful. Excuse me, I'm laughing. It reminded me, first of all, I have 2 anecdotes on that. One is by Koka. I mean, this judo champion, I mean, the fighter in the wind. Multiple in judo, Japanese, when they ask him, you know, he had only 3 techniques he used, right? Okay, right. Koka, if I make a mistake, you use more. My apologies, but as far as I remember, I used 3, right? And then, you know, these Seonage, which he did, or Ushimata, which he did. And then many people, especially Seonage, which he did, no one could resist. So then he came to the Western Europe, America. He just threw everyone, ippon. And then they asked him in an interview, it was lovely. I never forget that. I mean, possibly, maybe if he watches this, they asked him, how can you do that? You see it coming, but you cannot stop it. He said the problem of Americans, especially, and Europeans, also Westerners, is they always want to have more. When they come to Japan to learn, they say, what more? I said, they just train. They have judo has some techniques, train them. They want to have more techniques, more complicated. So what do? He said, I only train these techniques day in, day out, these 3, right? And then, you know, in judo, I'm sure you've seen it. I train because I do also judo and grappling. Now, is in COVID time. So we get our belt and put it around the tree. So he said, first I started with small tree, then bigger, then bigger. Okay, but what happens to the tree? Nothing. I just did seonage to a tree. And I imagined I threw that tree. So if you go and grab anyone and you think you can throw a tree, and you have been practicing it, Americans and Westerners practice it maybe 10 times. You practice it 10,000 times.
1,000 at least.
At least, yes. Right? That was this one. And another anecdote I have, oh God, I forgot the name of my colleague, what a shame. But he comes in Japanese from Shotokan circles. And you know, in this Tsuki, right, in Shotokan. When you know, he said Americans paid so much money to come to Japan to learn Shotokan Center. And they paid thousands to stay for 1 week, 2 weeks. And what did Japanese do? Oh, your Tsuki is not good. And they're all black belts, right? Tsuki. So they trained the whole day Tsuki. And in the evening, he said, the Americans were so angry. We paid so much money to come here. And they're only doing Tsuki. You know, what you said reminded me of, you know, in judo and karate circles, of the difference between Asian system and not American system, where you want to have, I'm not criticizing a Western system, not only American, Europeans the same, that we want to have more and more and more. And in Japanese, they just say concentrate on few. That's exactly reminded me of that, right?
Yeah. One of the reasons for a long time that I taught Sabre privately as well is that until this group of people came to me and said, teach us, there were very few people who enjoyed the idea of coming to visit Russ and doing 10,000 cuts that day. And we would start in the morning and we would start with 1,000 cuts. And after 1,000 cuts, I would know if you were throwing the cut from your arm, or if you were using your waist for power, or if there was something going on in your shoulder that needed to be addressed. It's not a big deal. It takes 18 minutes to throw 1,000 cuts if you're old like me and throw them slowly. How many people will throw 4,000 or 5,000 cuts in a single day? Most students won't do it, but it's inside the very basic techniques practiced over and over again mindfully. And I'll unpack that in a second because I have a little rant about it that goes to culture, that you really learn what it is you're doing. So practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes consistent. And when you are practicing, what you're doing is paying attention to the variations that creep into your technique. Some of those variations will be good. Some of those variations will be bad. After you've practiced your technique 10, 15, 20,000 times, the variations you consider bad will be better than when you were a beginner and you thought you'd gotten it perfect. And if you're not willing to train with that kind of mindset, I am the wrong coach for those people. So my classes have always been small, and I don't mind, because I'm especially looking for beginners and others who are willing to come at this humbly and to really discover what it is they're doing when they're doing it, who they are when they're doing it, and to confront all those things that keep us from changing and improving. Because you can't, if you're going to learn, you have to change. And the problem with change is you can't change and stay the same. People want to become masters without realizing that it means they're going to change from their hair to their toes.
That's right. What kind of, so you teach saber, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you teach any other swords or weapons in your system?
I do. Hold on, I'll show you another one. So being caught between 3 living lineages, I've sort of collected weapons we can do, especially with the savate that has several different lineages inside it. The family tree looks more like a family bush. But there's cane, baton. As you can see, I use rattan because it's friendly to bones as opposed to hardwood. This is called a fokos. It's a long-handed tomahawk, basically, or a lightweight cavalry axe. The folk means reversed. So any axe that has something on the back side of it could be considered a fokos, whether it was a military pick or a hammer-back axe or a spike-backed axe. In Hungarian culture, these are now basically carried by peasants who need to occasionally chop wood and yell at thieves and chase them away. Shorter versions of these were issued to soldiers in World War I. Longer versions have been carried as far back as we have historical records.